Welcome to our 15th episode of One Work, 5 Questions with Dr. M. Andrew Holowchak and your host, Donna Vitek. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Holowchak.
Glad to be here as usual.
Yes, it's nice to see you. Dr. Holowchak is a retired professor of philosophy and history who taught at institutions such as University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, and Rutgers University. He is the editor of the Journal of Thomas Jefferson and His Time, and the author of over 20 published books, numerous books, close to 150 essays on Thomas Jefferson too. His list of books and locations of his published essays can be found in the video description. With our show One Work, 5 Questions, I'll ask Dr. Holowchak 5 questions on one work of Thomas Jefferson's. Our 15th episode will be Jefferson and the Freedom of Religion, based on Query 17 of the Notes on Virginia. But first, let me give you a little background introduction. After having a vibrant discussion of Jefferson's views on Jesus, we segue to this discussion, hopefully equally as vibrant, of Jefferson's views of the necessity of freedom of religion. Dr. Holowchak has chosen analysis of Query 17 of Jefferson's Notes on Virginia instead of Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists. Oh, is there a reason why you chose the query instead of the letter to Danbury Baptist?
Yeah, because I think there's more going on in this query.
Okay.
As opposed to everybody picks up the letter to the Danbury Baptist because that's when Jefferson's most impassioned plea for freedom of religion. It's his most noteworthy work. But I think this is a much more interesting and elaborate plea for freedom of religion. So that's why I like query 7.
Oh, that's good. I'm interested in learning more about this because I know a lot of the Supreme Court rulings actually use the letter and Danbury Baptist to justify their rulings on freedom of religion. So I'm interested to learn more in-depth thoughts of Thomas Jefferson's on freedom of religion. So are you ready to get started?
Well, let's go. Let's rock. Sure.
Okay, question number 1. Jefferson begins this query by dilating on the history of religion in Virginia. Why does he deem that needed?
Well, I think he just wants to give a little bit of background on the religious persecution, lack of diversity of religion in Virginia. And so, I mean, for example, he talks about in 1705, he says, if a person brought up in the Christian religion denies the being of God or the Trinity, or asserts there are more gods than one, or denies the Christian religion to be true, or the scriptures to be of divine authority, he is punishable in the first offense by incapacity to hold any office or employment, ecclesiastical, civil, or military. On the second, by disability to sue or to take any gift or legacy, to be guardian, executor, or administrator, and by 3 years imprisonment without bail. Now, that's just an example he offers, but it shows some of the problems of the lack of separation of the church and state. And, the religion has been, in Virginia, has been under the spell of Anglicanism till the Bill for Religious Freedom. And so, it's important to discuss. Now, he says, for example, he summarizes, this is a summary view of that religious slavery under which people have been willing to remain, who have lavished their lives and fortunes for the establishment of civil freedom. So he's trying to give some of the background and show the persecution of people who are not Anglican. And, you're talking about people who are forced to give money to the Anglicans, even if they're not Anglicans. And as more and more people come into Virginia, Anglicanism is not even the predominant. There are more non-Anglicans than there are Anglicans. So.
Right. We need Thomas Jefferson around today to help us with property taxes and what people pay for when they're not using certain services. But okay, question number 2. Jefferson then proceeds to a series of arguments militating for freedom of religion. Why is freedom of religion so vital for Jefferson?
Well, it's because freedom of mind is vital. And, religion, freedom of religion is probably, for most people, the most intimate expression of freedom of mind. Freedom to choose their own religious beliefs, the way of expressing themselves. So, one way of answering that is just to say that its lack amounts to governmental tyranny. So it's a tremendously important thing for Jefferson. He says in many places that, what does he say here in Queer Studies? He says, our rulers can have no authority over such natural rights only as we have submitted to them. The rights of conscience we have never submitted, nor could we submit. We are answerable to them only to God. So, I mean, I've said this in a number of publications, is that government can force conformity of your actions. They can conform you, they can force you. Look what happens in Soviet Russia or in China. They can force you to behave in a certain way, but they can't control your mind.
Right.
They can't do that. So, and for Jefferson, freedom of mind is such an important aspect of property of Republican government. So,
right. So I believe that yes, it's important because of that reason, and I think that's why he was protective over every religion, or even not to practice religion. That freedom was important. Okay, question number 3. Could you give in just some of the most significant arguments of freedom of religion in the query?
I can. I want to say one thing. When you read this analytically, very, very carefully, what you find is a large number of arguments thrown out for religious freedom. And there's almost a bit of confusion here. I say that nicely. I'm not trying to denigrate Thomas Jefferson, but he's throwing out almost in bulleted fashion, argument after argument for freedom of religion. One might expect just a few arguments and a few cogent arguments thrown out for in those arguments to find expression more eloquently. They're not. They're thrown out, I think, at least somewhat hastily. All right. I talked about the argument from right of conscience. There's another. He says the legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others, but it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Now you can imagine he's talking about the legitimate powers of government. They do not extend to rights of conscience. Whether I believe in God,
right,
I believe in 20 gods or no God, he says it doesn't pick my pocket or break my leg. It does me no injury, does no one else any injury. So now you can imagine that when the book gets published, this passage is going to get him in a lot of hot water. And it does. Jefferson is just rather flippant talking about the existence of God. Who cares if there's no God? Who cares if there are 20 gods? It doesn't do it. So he gets in a lot of trouble for this, obviously. And you can understand why. He says, reason and free inquiry are the only effectual agents against error. Give a loose to them. They will support the true religion by bringing every false one to their tribunal, to the test of their investigation. They are the natural enemies of error and of error only. So what he wants to say is, he's not saying necessarily that there is a true religion. I have argued, and I think he believes that all religions taken literally are false, because true religion is just, it comprises a man's relationship to other people, the dictates of morality, and a man's relationship to God. Those are his moral obligations, and many religions talk of that. So there are two aspects of many religions. He thinks the metaphysical trappings are all, make the religions ridiculous because they start talking about angels and life after death and things like that. But he says to say that we need to have free reason in studying religion is to say, okay, if we allow reason full expression, then reason will show the falsity of certain religions. And if there is one religion using sort of eliminative reasoning, meaning that if I have many options and if I can prove that several of these options are false, then I've reduced my options and I've done some work at the end of the day. And it might be that if there is one religion that is the true religion, then reason will show it to be true sort of indirectly by it not being falsified when it's exposed to reason. Okay, then he talks of the Roman government permitted free inquiry, and he talked about how Christianity would never have been introduced, right, by not having that. Going back to, again, he says, it is error alone which needs the support of government. Truth can stand by itself. Subject opinion to coercion. Whom will you make your inquisitors? Fallible men, men governed by bad passions, by private as well as public reasons, and why set subject to it to coercion to produce uniformity. But is uniformity of opinion desirable? No more than of face and stature. Introduce the bed of Procrustes, then as many as there is danger that the large men may beat the small, make us all of a size by lopping the former. The bed of Procrustes obviously he would grab people, put them on a table. If you're too tall, I'm going to cut your legs down to make you, or if you're too short, I'm going to stretch you. Uniformity is not desirable in people, and that's why people have coercion in religious matters. They want to force you to become an Anglican or something. The very fact that we are introducing coercion shows you that it's probably not the right religion if it can't affect you just by reason, but if it needs coercion to do that. Coercion is, and we see the same thing, I think, going on with what's going on at Monticello, where they push the wokeism. Thomas Jefferson was a rapist, a racist, and had an affair with Sally Hemings. As I've argued, I don't think this has ever happened. But what they do is they use coercion. They do not allow open expression. They do not allow free expression of reason. There's no debate going on. They have the truth. So, Thomas Jefferson's talking about that as well. The very fact they don't allow free communication of ideas should make you suspect that something suspicious is going on. So these are some of the, one other argument, he says, there are 1,000 millions of people, right? And probably 1,000 different systems of religion. Now, for one person to argue that his of the 1,000 religions is the right one, right? And to see 999 other people disagreeing with him, you're not going to affect, even if you are right to say that my religion is the right one, you're not going to persuade 999 that they're wrong and you're right. Through coercion or persuasion, that you need to just allow reason to come to the fore. So those are some of his arguments, but the main thing is that freedom of consciousness is tremendously important for Jefferson in a robust Republican government.
And see, if we had studied Query 17, I think most of America would have handled the past 2 years a little differently when we talk about coercion and not able to have free expression. That's when you know that there's something wrong going on.
Our political system at all anymore, we don't value. It's scary to me because we don't value reason, number one. And debate, anything sort of goes. We don't even value truth anymore. And once we throw that out the window, then we're in a very, very difficult situation.
Yeah. Question number 4. You show in Thomas Jefferson Moralist and in several other writings that moral understanding is a matter of feeling or sensing, not reasoning. You argue also that true natural religion is equivalent to moral understanding. Why then does Jefferson advocate use of reason for religious understanding.
So the idea is if the truths of morality are identical to the truths of natural religion, duties to God and love of God, duties to your fellow man, love of your fellow man, these are things that we feel, we know by feeling to be true, by sensing, right, by our moral sense. We don't need to get at them by reason. So why does Jefferson advocate in this query and elsewhere use of reason? I've answered that already. I'll iterate that answer. He's advocating use of reason not to prove directly that this is true, but to eliminate all the pretenders, all the false religions. So once we start using reason and talk about things like turning water into wine, Jefferson says, okay, what makes you think that that could have happened? Can anybody today do it instantaneously? And we start using reason to investigate some of the claims of religion. We see the claims to be false, and we can have good reason to cast aside this particular religion or that particular religion. But it's not like it is to doing that. Again, if we have 3 people accused of committing a murder, and if I show that 2 people couldn't have committed the murder, that doesn't prove that the 3rd person did it. All it does is shows that he's left standing, right? We need positive evidence to show that the person committed it, not just evidence to show that the other people didn't do it. So reason at least eliminate the bad apples.
Okay, question number 5. You have 2 books on Jefferson and religion, American Messiah, The Surprisingly Simple Religious Views of Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson's Bible. And this is American Messiah.
Good book.
So we will have a lot of questions answered on his religious views in the reading of that book. Okay. I'm sorry, and critical, with Jefferson's Bible, with introduction and critical commentary, you argue in both that Jefferson was more an advocate of toleration of religion than of freedom of religion. Can you explain that?
Yeah, and this doesn't make a lot of religionists happy when I say this. Is that Jefferson is not talking about necessarily the overall benefits of having freedom of religion. In other words, if we allow all the different religions to express themselves, is this definitely a great social gain? Jefferson thinks all these religions are, for the most part, false. So what is the great social gain? There are a couple of quotes, one of which occurs in Query 17. He's talking about people in New York and Pennsylvania. He says, they have made the happy discovery that the way to silence religious disputes is to take no notice of them. Let us too give this experiment fair play and get rid while we can of those tyrannical laws. So this happy discovery, imagine people disputing something religiously fundamental like they used to do in early Christianity. How many angels can you put on the head of a pin? Now, Jefferson would be livid just listening to a discussion like that, which he thinks is just colossal stupidity and waste of time. Ignore them. So what he's saying here is that if you allow, even the most ridiculous religions, freedom of expression, that's the way you sort of silence them, by allowing them. But don't feed the fire, just allow them to do their thing on their own space in their own way, and things will be just fine that way. So that's what he means by you silence religious disputes by ignoring them. So in effect, he says in this query, in another places, that the absurdities of religion will really not, in effect, they'll sort of cancel each other out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I get that strategy. So by tolerating, he never advocated for.
It's not a nice thing. You'd like to think, well, Jefferson is just But some people have advocated Jefferson just, had tremendous respect for all the particular religions. But that's the trans-denominationalism thesis that, he had such respect that he donated money to various ministers of different religions. He had friends who were ministers of different religions, and all this is true. But he didn't do that because he thought the particular religions were great. He just thought the ministers were great.
Right.
Some of the sermons, some of the wonderful things they said in their sermons were morality enhancing, even though they believed in other things too that he probably thought were absurd. They were still good people.
Right, right. So I think we all need a little bit of Jefferson in us today. The tolerance. Okay, so that was our 5 questions, and I'm going to give you a little glimpse into what we'll talk about next time. Jefferson once said, "I cannot live without books." In an early 1771 letter to Robert Skipwith, he limns certain books for a gentleman's library. Jefferson gives a large number of books that ought to be in any man of Virginia high society. Next week, we offer an analysis of the list of his letter with the list of books. So Jefferson is recommending books that the men of Virginia should have in their library.
Yeah, he's going to marry, he's Robert Skipwith is going to marry into the family to some extent. And he asks, because Jefferson is such an intellectual, and Skipwith will ask him, well, what sort of books would you recommend, someone who has 500 pounds, what sort of books would you recommend for inclusion in a gentleman's library? And Jefferson can't, list it. I mean, Jefferson is going to go nuts and come up with a very long and elaborate list. At least you have to have we'll talk about that. But I'll offer you the teaser. I want to throw this out for people, for listeners, viewers. If you had $500 or $1,000, let's make it a thing. It's not a lot of money. And you wish to start a library, become an educated, a library that would show you to be an educated person of the day. Which books would you purchase? So think about that. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that next time.
I actually I actually wrote a list of 7 books. So I'm not going to share it. I want to see, I'll save this paper. And then when you give us the list of books Jefferson recommends, I'll see if any of mine are on the list.
On the list. Well, those are going to be books that are, I have my dog jumping up trying to get my attention. Little Jefferson here. Well, listeners maybe can play around with that. Think about books in Jefferson's day that they would have collected to be part of an important library from all the different subjects.
Did he lean towards philosophers? Did he have a lot of books written by ancient philosophers?
I don't say he leaned towards philosophers. I won't say anything, but I mean, it comes as a surprise that the vast majority of books, right? He breaks knowledge down into the fine arts, history, and philosophy, dealing with reason, memory, and imagination. And out of those 3, the recommended books lean heavily toward one of those, whether it be the fine arts, history, or philosophy books in one area, and it might come as a surprise which of those 3 most of the books are under. So I'll leave it as a teaser, have people think about books that they might include, older books, Jefferson's that they might have included in the library for a gentleman.
Wow, yeah, that's what I did when I was reading through this, preparing for our show. I thought, what books would I want? But it may not match Thomas Jefferson's, because some of the books that I want are actually books that he wrote, or John Adams, or Abigail Adams, or Benjamin Franklin.
Well, if you put Harry Potter down, no. That would work. I don't.
No.
Probably a lot of people today would put stuff like, well, the gentleman's library, we need Harry Potter and Agatha Christie or something. Who knows? All right, we'll talk about that next week. And
okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's go back to our screen. And if you would like to contact Dr. Holowchak, you can do so at mholowchak@hotmail.com. He's available for to do presentations and seminars. His Facebook page is Thomas Jefferson, Bring Him Home to Monticello, Citizens for Change. And
or if I would add, if you'd like an autographed copy of one of the 2 books on Jefferson religion, the critical commentary on the Bible with his Bible in it, or just the book on Jefferson's religious views. If you email me, I can give me an address. We can arrange to have an autographed copy sent.
Oh, that's wonderful. And you have another book, aren't you? Your grandfather's book, too. Would you like to talk a little bit?
It's called The Oath. It's a story of his trip out of war-torn Ukraine. In the war we're talking about is World War I, and his journey to the United States. So it's fun. Actually, I'm working on the screenplay of that book potentially for a movie. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, this would be wonderful. And even looking at the history back from your grandfather's time in comparison to today, what are some similarities and differences in what's going on? So thank you so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge on Thomas Jefferson.
Thank you once again for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. It's always a pleasure. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and we'll see you next week.